Ever feel like people underestimate you? They just don't see your potential?
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to dive deep into the story of a guy who knows that feeling all too well.
Okay.
St. Thomas Aquinas. He's known for his brilliant mind and groundbreaking theological work.
Right.
But get this, he was actually nicknamed the Dumb Ox when he was younger.
Really?
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack his life, his ideas, and why he still matters today, even centuries later.
Sounds fascinating.
And we'll be drawing from the St. Thomas Aquinas episode of the Catholic Saints podcast by the Augustine Institute. They always have great material.
I've heard good things about that one.
So to kick things off, Thomas was born in 13th century Italy
Okay.
into a wealthy family. They had big plans for him. They wanted him to become an abbot.
An abbot. So like a traditional path.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Not exactly the image that springs to mind when you think revolutionary thinker, right?
You'd think he'd be content with that kind of comfortable, traditional life.
Right. But then something unexpected happened.
What's that?
He encountered the Dominican order.
Ah, the Dominicans.
Yeah, they were like the new kids on the block back then, shaking things up in the church.
They were all about revitalizing theology, weren't they?
Exactly. They really wanted to bring a new energy and intellectual rigor.
Mm-hmm.
And they tackled heresies head on, emphasized rigorous study and preaching.
Sounds pretty appealing to a young guy with a thirst for knowledge.
It must have been. And for Thomas, it was. So instead of the quiet life of an abbot, he chose this dynamic, intellectually challenging path.
That's a big decision.
It really is. And speaking of making an impact,
Okay.
we can't forget about the influence of his mentor, St. Albert the Great.
Oh, of course, St. Albert.
He was the one who saw something special in Thomas, even when others didn't.
Even when he was being called the Dumb Ox.
Yes. Even with that nickname, which, can you believe it, came from his own classmates because he was so quiet and unassuming.
I guess appearances can be deceiving.
They really can. But Albert, he knew better. He even famously predicted that one day Thomas would bellow so loud the whole world would hear.
Wow, what a statement.
It really shows you the power of a mentor who truly believes in their student.
It makes you wonder if those classmates ever felt silly later on.
I know. But anyway, back to Thomas. He really took his calling as a teacher to heart,
He did.
focusing on things like theology, scriptural interpretation, and church doctrine. He dedicated his life to teaching within the Dominican order and at those newly established universities in Paris and Italy.
And he didn't just teach to teach, did he?
No, not at all. He saw it as a way to share the fruits of his own contemplation.
I like that.
And it's beautifully summed up in the Dominican motto, contemplate and hand on to others the fruits of contemplation.
That's a good one.
Thomas truly lived by that. He wanted to help others grapple with those big questions,
Right.
the ones about faith and reason that he was wrestling with himself.
And that brings us, I think, to his most famous work.
You're talking about the Summa Theologica.
Yeah, the Summa, a massive work.
It covers like every theological topic you can imagine, right?
Very much. But what's amazing is how he structured it. He used a question and answer format.
That must have made it a lot more accessible
I think so, yeah.
than all those dense theological treatises that were popular back then.
Oh, definitely.
The Summa Theologica is a masterpiece of clarity and comprehensiveness.
Couldn't agree more.
I mean, it dives deep into complex issues, but somehow stays clear and engaging.
It shows he really cared about making those truths understandable.
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to reach a wider audience.
Absolutely.
And that wasn't just reflected in his writing style.
Oh, how so?
Well, he was also convinced that truth could be found everywhere.
Not just in religious texts.
Exactly. He was open to exploring wisdom from sources outside the usual religious sphere.
Interesting. Any examples?
A prime example is his engagement with the works of Aristotle.
Aristotle.
Yeah. Now, this was controversial because in Aquinas' time, Aristotle was seen as a pagan philosopher.
So using his works would have raised some eyebrows.
Oh, for sure. It was like going against the grain.
But that's Thomas for you, always challenging the status quo?
He was all about pushing boundaries in his search for truth. He saw the value in Aristotle's ideas and found ways to integrate them into a Christian framework.
He was a true bridge builder,
That's a great way to put it.
bringing together faith and reason, Christian theology, and ancient philosophy. Pretty revolutionary for the 13th century.
Makes you wonder if he was kind of anticipating those faith versus science debates.
Oh, interesting.
You know, the ones that pop up even now.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
His work still offers insight into how we can reconcile those two sides.
Definitely. He truly believed that the natural world, reason, and philosophy could all lead us toward God.
No need to choose between faith and intellect.
Exactly. They work together.
I wonder what his critics back then thought about all this.
Well, let's just say not everyone was thrilled.
Oh, I bet.
Some of his ideas, especially those incorporating Aristotle, were condemned at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
That really shows he wasn't afraid to challenge the established way of thinking.
He wasn't afraid to push boundaries, even if it meant facing criticism.
He was committed to truth.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how he balanced this intellectual rigor with humility.
And prayer.
Yeah, it's a beautiful paradox.
Here's this brilliant mind exploring all these complex concepts.
Right.
Yet he still acknowledged the limits of human intellect and sought guidance from something higher.
There's that story about him trying to solve a tough theological problem.
And he rests his head on the tabernacle.
Yeah, like he's looking for inspiration directly from the source.
Shows you the depth of his faith.
And his humility. It's a good reminder for all of us.
Speaking of stories that highlight his character.
I know which one you're going to mention.
The one about him finishing his work on the Eucharist.
Yes!
Can you imagine?
It must have been an incredible moment. Thomas, after putting his heart and soul into this massive treatise, and then Christ appears to him.
Wow. What a reward in itself.
And Christ, recognizing all that Thomas had done, offers him any reward he wants.
Anything at all.
Imagine that. What would you ask for?
I don't even know.
But Thomas's response is so powerful in its simplicity.
Nothing but you, Lord.
Gives me chills every time.
It just cuts to the core of who Aquinas was.
It wasn't about fame or recognition.
Just pure love for Christ.
Exactly, a desire for union with the divine. A true mark of sainthood.
It's a good reminder for us.
It is.
No matter what we achieve, it should always lead us back to that relationship with something greater.
Couldn't agree more. It really makes you think about what you're seeking in life, doesn't it?
So we've talked a lot about Aquinas' life and his ideas.
We have.
But for someone who's maybe not a theology expert,
Right.
what are the key takeaways? Why should we care about this guy, centuries later?
That's a good question. I think there are a few things we can learn from Aquinas that are still relevant today.
Okay.
First, he teaches us to approach knowledge with both curiosity and humility. He was open to all sorts of ideas.
Even the ones that challenged him.
Exactly. And he was always willing to learn.
That's something we could all use more of these days.
For sure. Second, Aquinas reminds us that faith and reason aren't enemies. They could actually work together, complement each other.
So it's not about choosing one or the other.
Right. They're two different ways of understanding truth.
Truth about God, the world around us.
Exactly.
And lastly, Aquinas' life really shows the power of love.
Especially love for God.
That love drove everything he did, his work, his teaching, his path to sainthood.
It's a powerful example.
It shows that knowledge and intellect are best when they're rooted in something deeper.
Something that connects us to a greater purpose.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into St. Thomas Aquinas, I want to leave our listeners with a question. How can we, in our own search for knowledge and truth, embrace that same spirit, that open-mindedness, the rigor, the love for God?
It's a great question to reflect on.
And for those who want to keep exploring Aquinas' ideas,
Yeah.
what resources would you recommend?
Well, there's the Summa Theologica itself.
The big one.
You can find it online in different translations.
And for a maybe easier intro,
The Dominican Order has a great video series called Aquinas 101.
I've heard good things about that.
And if you're looking for biographies, G.K. Chesterton's St. Thomas Aquinas is a classic.
Always a good choice.
It's witty and insightful. And for a more recent perspective, there's Thomas Aquinas, a portrait by Denise Turner.
Great recommendations. We'll include links to all of those in the show notes.
Perfect.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey exploring St. Thomas Aquinas,
It has.
from dumb ox to doctor of the church.
Quite the journey.
His story truly shows the power of curiosity, humility, and a love for truth.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll leave you to continue your own explorations.
Happy exploring.
Until next time, keep diving deep.